So good evening, everyone. We're back. Welcome to the opening night concert, Indian Hill Orchestra, for this season. And it's a bit of a whopper of a concert for you. All three great, outstanding compositions, all classics in the repertoire, from the Romantic era, which is why we're calling the concert The Classics, How Romantic. Beginning with the beginning, which is always a good place to start, an overture by Richard Wagner. Now, we've all heard of that name before. He's famous for his music dramas. You know, he did not call them operas, he called them music dramas, because it was supposed to be a combination of all kinds of artistic elements, music and sound and light and action and drama and all the rest of it. And most of his music dramas were based on such things as the mythological gods, the murders, love potions, and curses and all that kind of stuff. This particular opera from which this overture comes has nothing to do with any of that. So that's one thing I want you to remember when you're listening to this piece. It still has the kind of density and certainly tunefulness that we associate with Richard Wagner, but it's a little more classic from the constantly wavering harmonic motion that you find in his larger, more, I don't want to say more traditional pieces, but the other, the music dramas. Sorry, I almost called them operas. Sorry, Richard. In fact, this is his only of his mature age comedy. This is not about the myths or mythology or anything like that. This is simply about humanity. This is about people. This is about shoemakers and how the shoemakers all just have a singing contest. Something just totally innocent. This is not Germany's Got Talent or anything like that, but it's a singing contest where, you know, and of course there's a love interest as well in the story. But it's important to remember, as a matter of fact, I reminded the orchestra just last night that this is a comedy, and to approach it with a lighter spirit, not that deep, dark, Germanic, angst-filled kind of spirit, but rather something light and almost frothy. Of course, they laughed at me when I said that. But it really is true, and it actually makes a difference to both the playing and to the listening of this piece. So the overture, which actually has, of course, themes from the opera, as any good overture really would have, is in 4 parts itself. It begins with a march. You've all heard it before, probably somewhere. Da 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 da. Yeah, see, I see heads nodding and etc., etc. So that's the march. And one thing you might want to remember about that is that Wagner also is known for the Germanic term leitmotif, Leitmotiv, which has to do with, in all of his other music dramas, he would assign a certain melodic twist or turn, just a little catchphrase that is associated with that actor or actress. So whenever they're on stage, you hear treatment of that motive. It's all supposed to tie together that way. So in this case, whenever the masters, the shoemaker, the cobbler masters, enter the stage, you hear da, ta, 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 ta. It's the march, or some version of it. Secondly, then there's a fanfare, which sounds, it's in the same key, sounds real close to it. Da ba da da ba ba da 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 dee da da ba ba da da da, and it's a processional that you can just imagine. Now count your blessings. We're only doing the 9-minute overture, not the 6-hour opera. There's a third theme which occurs, which actually provides contrast in the overture to this almost boisterous happiness that we have. And that's the love song, which actually wins the singing contest. Dee da da dee da 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 dee da dee da dee da da dee da dee, or some version of that. Okay? And then finally, and this is the interesting part that even the orchestra needs to keep in mind, there's an irreverent version of the march. You know, I sang for you, ba, 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 right, as the march. This is, which was the apprentices mocking the masters in the opera. You know, that's how the song should go, and of course they all say no way. So, but it has this wonderful opening and a great closing to the piece, and I think it's just a wonderful way to start a season. Bright C major chords, nothing too terribly dark or introspective or anything like this. Just great music played by a great orchestra, and so I know you'll love it. As a matter of fact, I've even been thinking, just between you and me, that maybe the first piece we play in our new facility in a couple of years might be this overture, because it features the full orchestra and it will just immediately fill that wonderful room with sound, orchestral sound. So the piece was composed in 1867. Wagner was in his 50s, so he had another decade or two to live. So he wasn't completely done yet, but it's close. It's definitely in his maturity and is towards the end of his life when he decided to write this, of all things, a comedy compared to all of his other material. Okay? Keep that in mind. Second piece on the program features our guest artist, Rachel Barton Pine. Fabulous violinist. You are in for a real treat. Doing one of the world's greatest concertos for violin by Jean Sibelius. Jean is Jean, from Finland, basically recognized as the most important and popular and favorite composer from Finland, from the late 1800s into their first half a century of the 20th century. Jean Sibelius is known for composing a lot of music based on the Finnish Kalevala legends. He's famous for composing Finlandia. You know, you've all heard of Finlandia. I was just about to sing a tune for you, and all of a sudden I can't remember how it goes. How does it go? See, I don't have to do it. Anyway, Sibelius composed this piece in 1904 when he was almost 40 years old, not quite. So he's a mature enough composer at this point. Now, one thing to remember about this is that he himself was a violinist. And in his early days, he aspired to being a concert violinist himself. But for some reason or other felt that, I think he lost a competition or something, or lost an audition, and for that turned him off completely, and he decided to go in another direction, so he turned to composing. And of course, we are all the benefit of we benefit from all of that effort. He composed close to 7 symphonies. Well, he did actually compose 7 symphonies, and much other great concert music that has made it to the concert stage and will be there for many years. So this piece starts out in a very interesting way. You just hear our violins playing very quietly. People like to associate this kind of a sound in his music with the great Nordic landscape. You know, this is the far north. This is the barrenness of that. It's such a cold land kind of thing. I don't know if that's true, but you can associate with that if you want to. What's interesting is that while he has some of the violins doing dee-do, 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 he has others at the same time doing da-da-da-da-da-da-da, the same notes. So you hear whoa, 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 without hearing dee-do, dee-do, or one or the other. It's a really wonderful effect. And then the violin, solo violin, after only a few seconds comes in, dee da do, dee da dee do, dee da da dee da da dee da 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 dee da da. It's really a gorgeous sound, and Rachel plays it fantastically well. It's just a beautiful, beautiful sound. What's interesting about the piece formally, structurally, is the fact that there's a major cadenza in the first movement. This is where the orchestra stops and we all stare admiringly at the soloist in awe. How can she play so many notes so quickly? Kind of thing. And this serves the purpose structurally for the development section of what a traditional symphonic movement is. And then the orchestra comes back in later and we do what is called the recapitulation, when we basically repeat the original material before the cadenza and then finish it off in a flurry. It's a terrific piece, wonderful composition. This piece is famous for, because Sibelius was himself a violinist, famous for putting in all those virtuosic tricks and maneuvers that a violinist love or hate to play, and certainly are in the practice room 4 hours a day trying to achieve. She's really amazing at this. A wonderfully slow second movement follows, starting out with just clarinets, dee da dee da dee da 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 dee, answered by oboes, dee da 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 dee da dee da, and then they finish out their phrase, and then after some horn movement and whatever, then the solo violin part comes in, dee da da dee, dee da dee da. Gorgeously slow moving harmonies throughout the whole piece. It picks up, of course, in the middle of the movement, but then comes away and just completely dies out in a wonderfully, not even melodramatic, it's just a very tender expression that Sibelius writes in this movement. The third movement is a direct contrast. Any good symphony or concerto, you're going to have contrast, movement to movement. So in this last movement, we have dum ba da dum ba da dum ba da dee da 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 da. We want to go to kind of go along with it. Bum 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 ba bum 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 ba dee ta ta ta. It's a bit of a country dance, if you will, and that movement too finishes out in a real flurry. You will love it, and if you are willing and able to stick around after the concert, she will join us for the Q&A, the Encore Cafe, in here afterwards. So please make a point to do that. She was sharing with me her concert schedule over the next few weeks, and it truly is amazing. She has something like 6 or 7 or 8 different concertos that she's playing in the next few weeks, as well as a solo recital in Singapore and blah, 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 whatever. I mean, it's true. She's an amazing talent and a wonderful person to boot. After intermission, we do this symphony called From the New World. So I'd like to put you into a historical context here. Think of the year 1850. A girl was born named Jeanette Myers in the town of Delhi, or Delhi, New York. Does anybody know where that is? Yeah. I had to look it up myself. It's about halfway between Albany and Binghamton. She was the daughter of an immigrant violinist from Denmark. Later on in life, she was educated at the Paris Conservatory, which is a famous institution, still is. It's also federally funded and is a national conservatory. They're very keen on developing a French style of composition or performance or whatever, and have been for centuries. Then in 1869, at the ripe age of 19, she got married to someone named Francis Thurber, who became a millionaire in the wholesale grocery business. Now I mention that because now Jeanette Thurber became one of America's first patrons of the arts. And in 1884, so she would have been 44 years old, she sponsored New York City's first Wagner festival. See, there's a tie in this program. In 1885, just a year later, this is the most important thing to remember, she founded the National Conservatory of Music in New York City and its partner, the American Opera Company. What she wanted to do was have a national conservatory like the Paris Conservatory that not only was federally funded, but also created a unique American art form, but also, and uniquely, sponsored students who were female, who were of color, and who were disabled. That was a prime target goal of hers. And actually, by the year 1900 or so, only a dozen years or so later, the conservatory had seen 3,000 students pass through its doors. Pretty amazing accomplishment. Even in 1888, just a few years later, she sponsored the New York City debut of the Boston Symphony. So, in 1891, she wrote a letter to this guy named Antonín Dvořák, famous Czech composer. He had already established quite a significant reputation. Wasn't totally worldwide. He was probably known in maybe a handful or slightly more countries around the world. But she had heard about him. He was teaching at the Prague Conservatory. And she asked him if he would come to New York City to be director of her National Conservatory, which he turned down apparently a number of times. But when she offered him $15,000 a year, which was, get this, 20 times more than he was getting in Prague, he accepted. So Dvořák comes to America and absorbs our culture at the time as quickly as possible. And soon starts writing this symphony from the New World. Not of the New World, but from the New World. Almost as if it's a postcard to his friends back home about what American culture is like or what the sounds are. So, it's interesting also that it was Jeanette Thurber who was apparently suggested to him that title, that it should be From the New World. He had, in the National Conservatory, an African-American student named Harry Burleigh, who used to mop the floors as a student. That was part of getting his tuition credit. He would mop the floors, but he'd be singing spirituals the whole time. Dvořák heard him and actually arranged several times for Harry to sing spirituals to Dvořák. And Dvořák then, like he would have in his own home country in the Czech Republic, would have listened to the native musics and decided to incorporate them into symphonic products. That's what he did here too. So the one tune that you're going to hear in the slow movement of this symphony has been oftentimes called Going Home. Dee-da-dee, going home, dee-da-dee-da-da. Doesn't quite go like that. But actually what you should remember is that it's not a spiritual. It's his own composition in the style of a spiritual. And it was another of his African-American students from the conservatory years later, I think it was 1922 or something like that, that the student put the words going home to the melody, okay? So just admire the symphony and that melody in particular for the fact that it's original. You'll hear in the third movement, because Dvořák himself was a big fan of Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha. You'll hear Indians dancing, he said, at one. bum-ba-dum, 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 and you can almost imagine that. Again, it's not original Native American music. It's what he comes up with it. Other people will think they've heard Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. Other people will think they've heard Three Blind Mice. There's a passage in there. Basically, the whole orchestra is playing bum 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 bum. It does not go on, fortunately. If he only did one time, ba 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 ba, then we would know. So Dvorak was quoted as having he stated, "I am convinced that the future music of this country must be founded on what are called Negro melodies. These can be the foundation of a serious and original school of composition to be developed in the United States. These beautiful and varied themes are the product of the soil. They are the folk songs of America, and your composers must turn to them." And somehow or other that never really came to fruition. Yes, there have been sporadic attempts by various composers over the years, over the decades, and since those days. But somehow or other we've never really developed, I know, somebody's going to say, well, what about Gershwin? But a symphonic tradition based on our own native melodies, which are in abundance throughout. So maybe there's still hope for us. He further explained later on, he says, "I've not actually used any of the Native American melodies. I've simply written original themes embodying the peculiarities of the Indian music, and using these themes as subjects have developed them with all the resources of modern rhythms and counterpoint and orchestral color." And there you have it. And since the piece was first performed in Carnegie Hall in 1893, when he was still residing in the United States, it was a huge success at that performance. There was applause after every movement. Don't feel obligated. After every movement, as such as was the custom back in the day. And he felt the need, he said, to stand up and acknowledge the applause after every movement. Now, isn't that a lively experience? Maybe we should start something like that. You just clap any old time you want to. Well, no. He said, in the Negro melodies of America, I discover all that is needed for a great and noble school of music. Let's only hope that that's still the case. There are and have been African American composers in the ages since then. I just came across a few weeks ago a composer from his period, William Dawson, who composed several symphonies. It's likely that William Dawson might be featured on one of our concerts sometime soon, because I'm really enamored of his musical style. And there are other composers as well. Harry Burleigh, the student who sang spirituals in the school, himself turned into being a composer, mostly of spirituals themselves and vocal music, but a composer nonetheless. But ever since that first performance in Carnegie Hall in 1893, the piece has been an outstanding success. And it was that performance that created perhaps one of the most monumental events of his own life. And actually, as I read one critic say, he then became world famous, not just a handful of countries, but thanks to this symphony and its popularity, which still exists as one of the most popular symphonies today. It's established him as a great, outstanding, world famous composer. And so it's with these three pieces in mind, the combination of them, that I ask you to join us on our opening night and just celebrate the fact that we're starting up once again. And with 3 wonderful symphonic pieces that you can just choose to listen to however you want to. You can sit back and relax, or you can just be engaged in your seat while listening and listen to the inner dynamics that are going on, making the orchestra as much a visual experience as it is an oral one. Watch all the dynamism and the communication that's going on from player to player. It's all very subtle, so you may not see very much, but a lot of it is there. You see the front stand string players communicating with each other just by a glance. You'll see the people in the bass section looking all the way over to the violins and looking amongst themselves. The looking happens everywhere in an orchestra concert, always. But especially in a piece like this, or a program like this, where we have 3 extremely standard pieces where they can themselves relax into the music and just share it with you. So I hope you enjoy. Welcome. It's great to have you back. Enjoy the season, everybody. Thank you.
This is just a very short comment, not really a question. I think what we heard today was the definitive Sibelius.
Absolutely.
Another question or comment?
Back that way.
Oh, yes.
Rachel, thank you all for everything. I noticed that next week you're in Holland, Michigan, but you're playing the Tchaikovsky Violin Concerto, and then the next piece is Shredding with the Symphony Quartet, featuring your string quartet arrangements, favorite rock and metal songs, plus intense classical favorites. What is that?
Yeah, so I've been a big heavy metal fan since I was a kid, and what's really interesting is there are so many deep connections between some of the great rock music and classical. A lot of the famous rock guitarists grew up studying classical, listening to classical, consider their music to be classically inspired. And so as a fan of both genres, I thought it was a great opportunity to kind of reach out to my fellow rock fans and spread the word that, hey, you can like both. And if you like this stuff and the bands you like this stuff, maybe you should check it out because it's really awesome too. So what I do is I'll go and do kind of community engagement concerts prior to my big symphony shows, where the symphony will lend me a few musicians, a few colleagues, and I have some string quartet arrangements of AC/DC and Led Zeppelin and Metallica and Black Sabbath and stuff like that. But then I'll intersperse it with some, real classical music, Shostakovich and Paganini and Vivaldi, and then say, hey, why don't you come hear the symphony in a couple nights? And it's really exciting when you get those first-time audience members and they come up to you after the show and they say, I've never seen an orchestra concert before, but I really loved it. So that's really, really rewarding. But yeah, I've got a crazy next few weeks. I was just doing the Barber in Oklahoma. Then I have, as you said, Tchaikovsky next week. Then I have Bach recitals in DC and Salt Lake. Then I go to Madison for the Cacciatorian. Then I go to Singapore, where I do Scottish Fantasy the first week and Elgar Concerto the second week, etc. Another question.
Hi, questions and comments. I really enjoyed the violinist and how does she play so many notes and all. And a question for Bruce on the New World Symphony. I've always interpreted the New World Symphony as yes, a postcard as you suggested, but is it because he just came from Czechoslovakia and considered America like a new place to come?
Yes,
Could
absolutely.
you elaborate on that?
Yes, he moved to New York City at the invitation of this lady who was running the National Conservatory of Music, newly founded. And so he took the ship directly across the Atlantic from Czechoslovakia and was here in the country for 3 years. One of my favorite parts of his stay was in the summer of 1893, the summer immediately following the composition of this New World Symphony, when he went to Spillville, Iowa, which has a fairly large Czech population. And some people say that that's where he was and felt the expansiveness of the the prairies out there, which is reflected in some of his music. So he was around till 1895, and then he went back to Czechoslovakia.
Another question?
It's a question for Rachel. When you were mentioning all of the repertoires that you had upcoming, it struck me that they're quite different in styles, and I was wondering if you had more than one instrument that came with you that would, be different for different styles?
Yeah, great question. So I only have one quote-unquote modern violin, meaning an instrument. Well, this violin that I play that you heard tonight is my main instrument, made in the year 1742 by Guarneri del Gesù. Guarneri and Stradivari are considered to be the two greatest violin makers ever, and it's really just a matter of taste, which one you prefer, kind of like white wine or red wine. Strads are very, very sweet, golden sound. The Guarneris tend to be very rich and deep and dark, though they can also be sweet when they want to. There are fewer than a tenth as many Guarneris in the world as there are Strads, so if you happen to prefer the Guarneri sound, it's very lucky to have one because there aren't enough to go around. But many artists like Paganini, Chrysler, Heifetz, Isaac Stern, a lot of people through the years have played Guarneris rather than Stradivarius, and I've always love the Guarneri particular sound, maybe because I'm a heavy metal fan. But in any case, this particular instrument belonged to first, well, we don't know who owned it in the 1700s from when it was made in 1742, which by the way, was the same year that Paganini's was made. In the early 1800s, it was the concert instrument of Antonio Bazzini, one of the great post-Paganini violin virtuosos. And in the latter half of the 19th century, the 1800s, it was played by Marie Soldat, one of the great European soloists of her era. She was discovered as a teenager by Brahms and became a close chamber music collaborator with Brahms and one of the first champions of his concerto. And even back then, sometimes these instruments would be out of the price range of an artist who might deserve one. And so Brahms found an aristocratic family who agreed to buy an instrument for Marie Soldat's use, and Brahms himself chose this violin. So it's amazing to think that Marie Soldat was playing this instrument when she was playing chamber music with Brahms, which means my violin got to jam with Brahms. Of course, I say my violin, it doesn't belong to me, it belongs to my generous patron, and I'm very lucky to have it on lifetime loan. However, when I say it's been modernized, the violin family of instruments was invented around the 1490s, and they were altered 300 years later. In late 1700s, they started getting new necks. They would chop off the neck, put one on that was thinner and at a steeper angle. They would rearrange their innards a bit, put a longer, stronger fingerboard on, etc. All of these changes were meant to make the instrument louder and more projecting. Louder doesn't mean better, it just means louder. Nowadays, of course, we have amplified instruments to make them louder yet. Again, they're louder. So there's pros and cons to each kind, but when I play Baroque music, particularly, like for example, the music of Bach, like I'll be doing in a couple of weeks, I do use a Baroque violin, meaning an instrument that was made long ago but has not been altered to the new modern specifications as they've been made ever since. And so my Baroque instrument is a Galliano made, ironically, it's actually younger than my modern violin. It's 1770, but in its completely original condition. And that's really fun to play on the gut strings and hear that whole sound world. And if you want to learn more about kind of the differences between the Baroque bow and the modern bow and some of those topics, I actually have a YouTube video called RBP on JSB, where I discuss some of my thoughts about Bach and so on. But I've made recordings on both instruments over the years. And actually, ironically, I made a recording on a very obscure cousin of the violin called the viola d'amore, which is a 14-stringed instrument, or well, 12-string in the Baroque one that I have. My modern d'amore is 14. Yes, I have two of them. So I recorded the complete concertos by Vivaldi for viola d'amore, and I thought this was a kind of an indulgent artistic project that it certainly didn't have mainstream appeal. Even though Vivaldi's a famous composer, people aren't exactly clamoring for his viola d'amore concertos, even though they're totally beautiful. Nobody's ever heard of them. Nobody's ever heard of the instrument, right? But that actually became my one and only album thus far, which has gotten picked up by a major Hollywood blockbuster. The a significant part of the soundtrack. That movie that got all the Oscars last year, The Favorite. That's my Vivaldi on Viola d'Amore that you're hearing on there. And you don't even have to watch the movie to check it out because my album is all over the trailer as well. And I actually got paid more for the trailer because it was viewed by more people. I just found that out a few days ago.
Any other questions? Yes.
Really enjoyed learning about your diverse tastes, the rock, the classical. I loved your little combination that David Wallace put together. How do you feel about jazz violin, aka Stefan Grappelli, that type of violin music?
I love to listen to jazz violinists, but it's not one of the things that I've ever taken the time to get decent at myself. There's always so many different things to do. I actually play Renaissance and medieval music. I do Scottish fiddling to a basically professional degree at this point. I love blues, of course, contemporary music, like pieces by living composers. And of course my daughter is practicing with me every day, so there's never enough hours in the day, and jazz is so complicated with all of those chord changes and everything. I think you'd have to just make such a project of it, and while I appreciate jazz, I'm not quite passionate enough to put in the time to become good at it myself, so I just indulge in listening to others who are good at it, and there are certainly plenty of amazing jazz violinists out there, but I'm not one of them.
Tell us about your African American album.
Oh my God.
Oh, well, actually, neither of my Black composer albums are strictly African American. They're African diaspora.
Oh, okay.
So my first album of music by Black composers was violin concertos from the 17 and 1800s by Afro-European and Afro-Caribbean composers. That came out in '97. Music from the time of Mozart and Brahms. Gorgeous, gorgeous concertos that I recorded because they were, beautiful pieces that hadn't been recorded a lot that I wanted to share with the world. And I naively wasn't thinking about the, sort of the social ramifications of this album existing. And after it came out, it just got such a huge response from students and parents and teachers wanting to find more music by Black composers, that nobody knew that people of African descent were writing music way back then. And so it's kind of an amazing snowball effect, and it ultimately led to, I have a foundation that supports young artists through financial assistance, grants, and instrument loans. And so I ended up starting a project of my foundation a little more than 15 years ago called Music by Black Composers. And over the years, we've collected more than 900 pieces by more than 350 composers from 5 continents and 4 centuries. And we just published our coloring book of the 40 most important Black composers throughout history, a timeline poster showing more than 300 composers to show the depth and breadth of what exists, and also our first volume for violin, which we're particularly excited about. It's the start of our curricular series that we already have planned out. We're going to also have other series for other instruments. We have many, many resources on our musicbyblackcomposers.org website. I love the fact that it's not only the music and the stories of the composers, but we also feature role model profiles within the pages of our book, so that young people growing up without any examples of adult professionals in their field that look like them can see people who are working as soloists, Suzuki teachers, chamber musicians, etc., showing what kind of lives you can make for yourself if you grow up playing a classical instrument. And then we also have history articles talking about the Black orchestras of the 1800s, which were the equivalent of the Negro baseball leagues, talking about the fact that Frederick Douglass and Coretta Scott King were both seriously, very well-trained violinists. Stories that people just don't know, and so just dispelling the myth that this is somebody else's music. And the goals of the project are, first and foremost, to inspire and encourage African American youth to reclaim their history and be more likely to become part of classical music's future, but also to share this amazing repertoire with students of all races and ethnicities, so that all of us are performing on stage a wider range representing a more full human experience.
Great.
So that's what I do in my free time when I'm not parenting or practicing 10 different concertos.
Rachel, would you please repeat the name of the website?
musicbyblackcomposers.org. And of course, it is linked to rachelbartonpine.com and also the rbpfoundation.org. They're all linked to each other, so you should be able to find it. But it's just what you would expect, musicbyblackcomposers.org. Thank you.
We really enjoyed your music, but I have a different question. You're 1742 violin, right?
Yep.
What do you do to make sure that stays in prime condition and, you know, it's playing the way you want it to do? How do you maintain an instrument that old?
Yeah, so these instruments, because they're valued by collectors, basically they're not very liquid, but if you want to diversify your portfolio and you've got, 7 or 8 figures to spare, it's something that people will buy literally as an investment. They might not even be a music lover and buy an instrument. It's a strange situation. And so some investors think they're preserving the instrument by putting it in a vault and not letting it be touched. But in fact, that's actually not very wise, because think about if you didn't talk for 40 years. You'd be a little croaky at the end. And so there are certain instruments, certain other kinds of instruments where they do get worn out eventually. Certain maybe kinds of winds and brass, etc. But for string instrument, bowed string instruments, the instruments actually increase in complexity of their voices the more they're vibrated. Kind of like a fine wine aging or something like that. And so it's actually healthier for the violin to be played, as long as it's properly cared for, not exposed to extremes of dryness or heat or coldness, and taken to a specialized violin shop every couple of months to just check it out. And actually, one thing people don't realize in the construction of violin, made out of spruce and maple, the sides are glued with a very delicate glue to the top and back plates. And this is so when it's a little less humid and the wood slightly shrinks, you will get openings where the plates are put together with the side. And that's not considered damage, that's considered what's supposed to happen, because if it was a strong glue, then where it would split would be the grain of the wood, and then that would be severe damage. So it's designed so that the first point of give is the glue, and so you just, then of course it doesn't sound right, it's a little buzzy, or it's, the air isn't circulating in there and projecting out like it should, and voice starts to sound odd, and so then you take it to the shop and they squirt a little extra glue in there and you're good to go. Now, if you live in one place and are there year-round, then you only do this kind of as the seasons ebb and flow. But if you're flying continually to different climates every week, then of course, you might be in New Mexico one week and then in Florida the next week, and it's very dry and then it's very humid, and so you have to go to the shop more often. But yeah, the other benefit to the owner, of course, of the instrument being played is that the value of the instruments is predicated upon 3 main things: the renown of the maker, the maker's name, the condition of the instrument, how much damage it has or hasn't sustained over the years, and then thirdly, its history, called provenance. Was it owned by a famous violinist, or was a premiere of a famous concerto played on it, or was it in a famous collection at one point? The actual sound and voice of the instrument is a distant fourth in its valuation. But of course, having the instrument out there in the world, continuing to make recordings and be in the media and play concerts and so on, adds to its history. So that's, and of course the recipient of the instrument pays the annual insurance. So while it's extremely generous of an owner of an instrument to lend an instrument, believe me, they also definitely benefit in many ways from the arrangement.
So do you then audition for which violin? Are people standing in line to get you to play their violins?
Well, at this point, I'm pretty monogamous. No, it was really interesting because I borrowed a couple other really high-end antique instruments before this one. I had an Amati for a number of years, then I had a Stradivari, and I had a Del Gesù from 1744. And each time I was extremely grateful for the use of the instrument and loved lots of stuff about the instrument, but I always had a roving eye. I'd be curious to try my friends' instruments and so on and so forth. But now that I have this one, I just literally don't even, it's almost like I don't even have curiosity to play other instruments. I just love it so much, all I want to do is play it. And it's kind of like after I met my husband, I just stopped checking out other guys.
I heard a story that Yo-Yo Ma buys a seat for his cello when he travels. Do you buy a seat for your cello? Your violin?
Luckily, it's not that big.
Oh, a violin.
It fits in the overhead even of a puddle jumper.
You do put it in the overhead, though.
Well, you can't put it in the hold because it would come out in a bunch of matchsticks.
It might not come out at all.
But yeah, it goes in the overhead and there's no problem. One reason why I was glad when my daughter didn't decide to play the cello. I mean, somebody's got to play the cello, but, you know, it's a bit of a pain.
Have you ever had any problems on airlines?
Oh, yes, you know, from time to time. Yeah, well, I don't want to get into negativity here, but actually, I mean, probably most musicians at one moment or another have a problem somewhere along the way, but, you know, and then whenever it does, everybody's trying to be in solidarity and they're like, oh, I'm never going to ride that airline again, because obviously that airline is bad. But no, it's not. It's just that one flight attendant on that one day, usually. And, you know, basically every airline has messed up sometime or another. And statistically, if you think about the number of flights I've taken in my life and the few times I've ever had a problem, it's actually pretty good. So, yeah, there was one famous incident where I actually tweeted a picture of my husband and daughter sleeping on the floor of the terminal because we had been not allowed to board, and then the next flight was the next morning, but there wasn't enough time to like leave the airport and come to a hotel. So they crashed out on the floor. I, of course, was not sleeping because somebody had to stay awake with the violin. I tweeted them sleeping there, and it went viral and got picked up by national news. Kind of But it was amazing what people didn't understand about violins. People were like, well, why couldn't she just use a violin in the town that she arrived at? Or why couldn't she check it? Or, you know, why didn't she buy a seat for it? Or, like, that's not really how it works, guys.
I have two fairly short questions to answer. One is that concerto that was written by a person in the Caribbean, is that?
Oh yes, the Chevalier de Saint-Georges was born on the island of Guadeloupe.
Now,
and he ended up
can you
then going
pretty
back
well
to France.
tell that it's local color, or is the composer so familiar with European music that it sounds like all of that?
Yeah, you know, that's a really great question. Being in the black music research world for so many years, it's really clear that the thing that defines music by composers of African descent is diversity. You have composers from Latin America whose music sounds Latin American. You have composers from West Africa whose music clearly drawing upon those types of rhythms and tonalities, and then other composers, you know, composers from America whose music is maybe inspired by spirituals or jazz or even these days hip hop. But then you have plenty of composers who, you know, wrote music in the 1800s that sounds like the Romantic period, wrote music in the 20th century that sounds atonal. You know, you name it. There's every style you can think of. And of course, you've got composers who aren't black who write music inspired by jazz, etc. I haven't yet met a white composer who wrote hip-hop inspired music, but that's because only a few ever have yet. I'm sure it'll happen. And so, yeah, you can't ever listen to a piece and know anything about what the composer's racial or ethnic background is, or cultural background, or anything, because, you know, who wrote those, you know, great orchestrations of Hungarian dances? Brahms, you know, German guy. The Scottish Fantasy, great Celtic music by another German. I'm not singling out the Germans, those are just the examples that pop to mind. But yeah, everybody borrows everybody's music and celebrates their own, celebrates other people's, writes music that's completely international. It's just everything.
Yeah, just the other short question, I'm pretty sure. When you're playing, say, Baroque music on those instruments of that time, viola del more or whatever, do you feel obliged to use catgut?
Luckily, our feline friends have never been sacrificed for music. Their intestines aren't long enough. It's always been sheep. And the ironic thing is I'm vegan, but they have not yet invented a synthetic that has the sound that you need for early music instruments. So I do indeed use sheep intestines on my Galliano.
I think maybe just one more question, because I'm sure we could be here all night.
Speaking of cats, do you want to explain your sheet music that's on your little video that in the
Oh yeah, thanks for noticing. So I have this amazing art piece, and it shows up occasionally in various of my videos when I'm doing a little promo or an interview or whatever in my living room. First of all, the music stand is this ornate cast iron with candles music stand that was handmade by a friend of the electric bass player from the heavy metal band that I was in for a number of years. It's literally my heavy metal music stand. The art piece, I love cats. I grew up with multiple cats because I'm only home for like 2 days a week these days. I can't keep a mammal, much to my daughter's sadness. And so, yeah, so the harpsichord player in my Baroque trio Settecento, has multiple cats and is home enough to keep cats. And he had this amazing art piece that looks like sheet music at first glance, and then when you look closer, you see that it's actually cats. But the cats are like leaping around and doing things that fit, like when it says adagio, it's these big lounging around cats, and then it says allegro, and they're like jumping in and out of the sky. It's such a creative art piece, and I always admired it, and one day he gave it to me, and it fit perfectly on the cast iron music stand and decorates my living room right next to the Steinway.
There's one more.
Okay, one more.
Yeah, so tonight I was using my Dominique Picot. I do find that it's really interesting. Finding the right bow for your violin is a three-way match, because unlike a violin, which is ergonomically more or less comfortable by most players, a bow that feels really well balanced and totally comfortable in one person's hand can feel quite awkward in another person's hand. It's very, very personal. And so you need to find a bow that works for you, but then also a bow that's a tonal match on the instrument. You don't realize that, and I've done this kind of like a taste test with groups of people, where you play different bows on the same instrument and you hear different sounds, and it's really interesting. And part of it is what kind of sound do you want, but also what can draw the most out of that instrument. And so actually I had to try hundreds of bows to find just the right one for this particular Del Jesu. I always say far more than the number of guys I had to date to find my husband. And I have a spare, because I'm not always in town long enough to get a rehair. If I were to play continually on this bow, it would wear the hair out too quickly or too often. So I have a gorgeous replica that was made in New York by Isaac Selkow. And it just feels, I don't feel like I have to make any adjustment going back and forth. And from a distance, actually it has all the colors, but up close I can hear the difference. And for the romantic concertos, I always use the Picot. But actually for certain 20th century works, 21st century works also, I find that the Selkow has a little more bite. And then I have an original condition, an original condition early tourte, so like what we call a classical or a transitional period bow, which was used in the time of Mozart. And I use that for Paganini caprices as well as for when I play classical period stuff on gut. It's a little too soft to play like a Mozart concerto with an orchestra, with a modern orchestra who's using modern bows. But if I'm playing unaccompanied Paganini caprices or Mozart on my gut string instrument, then I use the transitional bow. And of course I have a Baroque bow. I have a high Baroque bow, which I'll use on my modern instrument, as you'll see in the RBP on JSB video. I also, because you need the bows out to really explain how it all works. It's a long story. But then I also have a Baroque bow that I use on my gut string instrument because it's a little lighter. And then I have a like a 17th century bow, even a little bit shorter, that I use when I'm playing it down on the arm, which was the original position of violins when they were first invented. So I do that for sonatas from the 1600s. And then of course I have a yew-wood medieval bow that I use for my rebec, which is the ancestor of the violin. And yeah.
And you thought that was a short question?
Oh, and a carbon fiber bow that I use with my electric violin, of course.
Well, not only did we enjoy your music, but we learned a lot about violins and bows and all the rest of it.
Thank you,
so
Rachel.
much.